Hello and good evening. My name is Charalambos Tsardanidis and I'm the director of the Institute of International Economic Relations. I welcome all of you to come in this event where I have the honor to host Dr. Stelios Stavridis, an old friend of mine, who is a senior research fellow of the University of Saragossa, and he's going to lecture us today with a very interesting topic: the European Parliament, the responsibility to protect, and Russia. And I would like to present the speaker. Since December 2007, Dr. Stelios Stavridis has been an NRI Senior Research Fellow in the research unit of European and International Studies in the University of Saragossa. And also, he is also an associate senior fellow at the Institute of International Economic Relations, so he belongs to our family. And co-founder and coordinator of the Gruppo Parlamente ACP, I don't know if I pronounce it well, sobre diplomacia, plural, okay? Yes, my Spanish had not existed at all. So in the past, he held a number of academic posts, including in the early 90s as a coordinator of the course of European Studies at the King's College London. He was lecturer at the University of Reading in the Department of Politics and International Relations, which was one of the first university which organized a Mediterranean course, Euro-Mediterranean course, during the period 1993-2002. And also he is holding Zamonet Chair in European Politics Studies, at which, of course, you know, is financed by the European Commission, and director of the Center at Reading of the Euro-Mediterranean Studies. He has been a scholar, a visiting scholar in many universities, like the Université Libre de Bruxelles, Sciences Po Bordeaux, Sciences Po Grenoble, Sciences Po Lyon, Sciences Po Rennes. There is other Sciences Po department in France, or you have visited all of them?
No, not all of them.
Louis University in Rome, the UAB private institution in Barcelona, and he is very well known from his research articles in very prestigious journals. We have published together 3 of such articles, but he's very well known for his research in parliamentary diplomacy. This speech is based on his recent publication, which the title is "The European Parliament, Russia, the War in Ukraine, Responsibility to Protect and Beyond," which has published in the Journal of Parliamentary and Political Law. So, also there is a long catalogue of his publications. I'm not going to mention this because we have no time for that, but he's very well known for his contribution on parliamentary diplomacy. Dr. Stavridis, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Professor Tsardanidis. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here. I'm glad that Professor Tsardanidis mentioned this parliamentary diplomacy aspect, because I think this is, if I can offer something, I think this is what I've been trying to do for over the past now 20 years or so. And this is why I'm glad to see so many people here. And it might be a strange title, because what is the link between EP? What is, I will mention this in my talk. And the paper is also, Professor Tsardanidis mentioned the publication in a Canadian journal. So it's based on, it's a kind of a summary of the main points. But the reason I'm mentioning this about parliamentary diplomacy is because this is one of the aspects of diplomacy that is not very well known. And Professor Tsadanidis mentioned this ICPA group, we have plural diplomacy. And plural diplomacy, if you like, is the umbrella name we found to include all different types of diplomacy: economic diplomacy, cultural diplomacy, sports diplomacy, even food diplomacy, even defense diplomacy. The list is huge. And I think it's important to know, to start by saying that when we talk about parliamentary diplomacy in general, and the parliamentary diplomacy of the European Parliament in particular, you have to consider that it's only a part of something much bigger. The concept of diplomacy, the practice of diplomacy has changed dramatically, and we have some diplomats in the room, so I have to be careful. I'm not saying that traditional diplomacy is no longer important or relevant. It's fundamental. But the fact that we have different forms of plural diplomacies means various things, including that the diplomats have to adapt to a new world. And I haven't mentioned the changes in communication, social media, and the rest of it. So you can imagine what I am trying to get at. And parliamentarians have had to adapt to this new world. And the European Parliament is a very good example. And I've worked on other parliaments, the Greek Parliament, the Cypriot Parliament, the Spanish Parliament, the French Parliament. But I still think the European Parliament is fundamental because it's a unique institution. It is the most advanced model of supranational / intergovernmental parliamentary institution in the world. It is both a model and also sometimes is seen as a problematic parliament because it's very active in international affairs. So when I had the honor of being invited to talk about this paper, I thought it's better to present something that has already been published rather than start doing something else, because it's a new topic, and also because responsibility to protect is a principle, a concept that is not an established concept. It's a new concept. Just a quick, how many of you have heard of R2P before today? I'm sure you have, but how many? Okay, not bad. Well, that's okay, that's good, okay. But it's important because, I will talk about this in a moment, but it's important because it's been in place officially at the UN level since 2005. Of course, before, but so let's use the official date. Well, in 2 weeks, it's 2024. In other words, it's been there for 20 years. So it's becoming important. What I will try to do in the presentation is, I mentioned already why the title is maybe is oxymoron or not, why it's still relevant to talk about this all the same. And then I will mention the basic characteristics of R2P, because I think it's important to have it very clear in our head what it is and what it is not. Because one of the reasons why I talk about Russia is because some actors in the international system use R2P when it fits them and when it suits them, and refuse to use it when it doesn't suit them. And also because it's linked to, I will mention this later on, with the UN, the Security Council. So Russia being a permanent member, you can imagine it's an important element. And then I will talk about, as I said, the European Parliament and R2P. And then I will go through a number of case studies. And the common link of those case studies is Russia. In other words, I'm not going to talk about the conflicts, but I'm going to talk about how the European Parliament is looking at R2P, how Russia is looking at R2P, and how those very often clash. And then come up with some conclusions. Another introductory point is, although I will talk about R2P, I will not only talk about R2P, because, as I said, diplomacy is much wider than that, and parliamentary diplomacy is even more important, if you like, has more means and instruments. So, and this is one of the arguments of the paper, that if you look at R2P, strictly speaking, you can say it has been used, it has not been used, why it hasn't been used. Of course it's important, but you have to consider that even if it's not being used formally by the parliamentarians, they may use other means And the other means maybe more important or as important as using or not using R2P. You have to look at the whole picture. It's not one, if you use R2P, good thing, is you don't use R2P, bad thing. It doesn't work like this. It's more complicated. Sorry. I will not go into this in detail, but R2P is not something that has come out of the blue. So you have a long tradition, international law, history, international relations. The most famous one is the Michael Walzer book, Just and Unjust Wars, which I recommend to everyone, 1977. It's a fundamental book in IR about and then the difference between the use of means and the ends. My Latin is not very good, so I won't mention anything. And then you have a lot of literature on humanitarian interventions, especially with Kouchner and the French doctors. Saving lives, that's the beginning of the argument. Lives means individuals. So you already see that we are starting to move away from wars, which is something between states, to individuals. So it's getting more confused. And the crucial elements for R2P, and this is out of the literature, are Rwanda in 1994, the genocide in Rwanda, and the genocide in Srebrenica in 1995 in former Yugoslavia. And this is why some experts say this R2P is a European and an African, or an African-European concept. It doesn't mean that no other states, countries, organizations, individuals were involved, but it's important. And it's also part of the UN. And this, I think, is an important element. And the first report, the official report, was in 2001. It was led by Canada. And this is the report that sets out the basis of R2P, which is then accepted formally by the United Nations in the General Assembly, in one of the General Assembly resolutions in 2005. And I think this is an important element. Like it comes out from genocides, from massacres. It has a humanitarian, humane dimension, and this is why I think it is important. And in terms of what R2P says and does, when I say it applies to atrocity crimes only, of course, it's a kind of a terrible thing to say, only to atrocity crimes, you know. But it's important to bear this in mind, because these are the crimes that they are not, it's not a question of levels. They are parallels. You can have genocide, you can have war crimes, you can have crimes against humanity, you have ethnic cleansing, but it doesn't have to be gradually getting worse or less. Whichever happens, R2P can be invoked. And hopefully it's horrific, atrocious. That's why they call atrocities crimes. And you have to bear this in mind. This is a shift in the human global system, that we have to do something about things that in the past happened and nothing was being done. I think this is fundamental. And you have three pillars, and it's important because you can see that it says it starts with the state where those atrocities crimes occurs. The state where these atrocities crimes occur is responsible for the protection of its citizens. So the first pillar is for the state involved to protect its citizens. The second pillar is the wider international community. And then, and this is, if you like, the most important one, if a state is manifestly failing to protect, then the international community must take action, appropriate action. And then you have three dimensions, if you like. They're not necessarily in a sequential order. Responsibility to prevent atrocity crimes, that's the most fundamental one. We all know that prevention, it is better to prevent than to cure. In all languages, the same phrase exists. It's not a coincidence. Okay. Then you have a responsibility to react. That's too late. Atrocity crimes are being committed. And then once you have intervened, you have a responsibility to rebuild. And when I say rebuild, it doesn't only mean physical or infrastructure reconstruction, but also reconciliation. If you can democratize the situation after a war, all this kind is involved. And I have put there European Center for Responsibility to Protect in Leeds. This is a European center. There are centers on R2P throughout the world, but this is one of the best ones. They have a huge literature. They organize annual lectures. They publish. If you put Leeds responsibility to protect, you will get a lot of information which I cannot develop here, but they are extremely useful. And this is the core. It is a revolutionary concept because it redefines the Westphalian-based traditional definition of state sovereignty. In other words, it doesn't mean that state sovereignty doesn't matter. It means that with sovereignty, the duty to protect its own population is necessary. And that's fundamental. In other words, national sovereignty, independence means whatever happens within my borders, my business is no longer valid. Of course, you can do what you want in your own country, but you cannot commit atrocities, crimes. And that's a rule for every single country in the world. That's what R2P says. Now, of course, the practice will be much more complicated. But it is fundamental to understand this is a challenge to traditional state sovereignty. I'm in charge of a country. I can do whatever I want because they are my citizens. No, I cannot kill them. I cannot commit atrocities, crimes. Because then the international community has a duty to intervene. So individual human rights are sufficiently important to warrant challenging absolute state sovereignty. That doesn't exist anymore on paper. Okay? It doesn't exist. And then the question is, well, what do we do with this? And one of the problems is whose authority for R2P? And it is understood that it is a United Nations Security Council that will decide when R2P applies or not. And as you can imagine, some members of the Security Council, the permanent ones, are more equal than others. That means they have a veto. So you will find a problem with the countries with vetoes because they can block a UN Security Council resolution. Now, I will not go into details of this, and this is from the center I mentioned in Leeds, you can see that it has been invoked in more than 80 UN Security Council resolutions, in more than 50 Human Rights Council resolutions, in 13 General Assembly resolutions. So this is something that is actually happening all the time at the UN. It's not unique, if you like. It's not something that doesn't happen very often. And now the key question, before I move to the European dimension, is the Security Council. So if you want R2P to be implemented, if there is no obstruction by the government or the state, the regime committing those atrocities, is relatively easy. Of course, it's not easy. It's atrocities, crimes. Come on, how can it be easy? It can't. But if there is cooperation with a regional organization like the African Union, then it's even faster. And then you also have to have the capacity. So if for instance, the use of force is allowed via R2P in the UN Security Council, you need to have the capacity to implement this use of force. And that may mean that non-regional actors have to intervene because they have the capacity that regional actors don't have. So it gets a bit more complicated. And I think it's important to bear in mind that because it is complicated, there is also a number of countries that have asked the Security Council to lift its veto right on R2P. It hasn't happened, but there is a call for the UN Security Council to the permanent members to lift their veto before any discussion takes place, any vote takes place, or at least not to use their veto. You can imagine this doesn't necessarily happen. Now, I'm going to move on faster, and I'm going to say that I'm going to look very quickly at Russia and R2P, and I have to say I am not a Russian expert. So I am using what I have read, and it may sound very, if you like, telegraphic, but I think it's important to understand the EP reaction if we start with the Russian approach. And the Russian approach, and this you have the references there, is that basically R2P is interpreted as a protection of ethnic Russians. And this is not only what the Russian discourse says, but also what we have in practice in the case of Chechnya, in the case of the war in Georgia in 2008, and the recognition of those two separate entities by Russia. And this is again an expert on Russia who says Russian leaders consider R2P a Western liberal, blah, blah, blah. So if you like, the position of Russia is very clear on R2P. If it suits our interests, we'll use it. If it doesn't exist. And we'll fight it. As I said, very telegraphic way of saying it, not very diplomatic way of saying it. But in practice, this is what has happened over the years. And as you can see, the 2008 Georgia war is after 2005. So the R2P was already in the UN. Now, on the contrary, and this is where I oppose the two, if you like, the EU in general is seen as a very pro-R2P institution. Not only the EU institutions, but also the EU member states. And there are R2P contact points in each foreign ministry, in each EU member state, and obviously in Brussels at the EU level. And there is coordination about R2P. So R2P is taken as useful, important, needs to be implemented. That's the EU position. It's very clear. And within those EU institutions, the European Parliament is extremely active on R2P. So it is, to use the words of Stefan, R2P normal interpreter role of the European Parliament. And with a colleague in Spain, we did, I will use some elements of this study on the Libyan case. The EP acted as a prime mover on R2P in Libya in 2011. It was pushing the other EU institutions and states to act under R2P. So it was clearly saying R2P matters. Now, I don't know how I'm doing with time, but very quickly I will go through some conflicts very quickly. This is an important one because this is an EP resolution in March 2011, that is to say before the intervention, the military intervention in Libya, led by the United States, the UK, France, and other NATO countries. Under R2P, there were two resolutions, especially the second one, that is to say all members of the UN Security Council accepted the use of R2P, some reluctantly, abstaining. And as you know, in diplomatic terms, abstention has a meaning in the UN. It's not by accident. So if you abstain, it means we don't really want this to happen, but we are not ready to block it. And it's important because, I will explain this later on, there was an agreement not only between the 5 permanent members, but also the Arab League, the African Union, and all other states. But there was an agreement to intervene militarily to stop the attacks on civilians and then on the rebels by the Gaddafi regime. There was no agreement, obviously, on prevention because it was too late, and there was no agreement on what next. And this is one of the key failures of that resolution. Troops on the grounds were expressly prohibited. For a number of reasons, going back to Iraq, doesn't matter. The fact is that what was supposed to be the next phase did not happen, and this is why Libya has been in a conflict since then. One of the reasons why Libya has been in a conflict since then, because the responsibility to protect, to rebuild was not implemented. The other element that I mentioned also very briefly at the beginning is the European Parliament pushed for R2P, but also took a lot of individual actions in favor of the opposition in Libya. I have a list there. This is from the article I mentioned before, which was published in, I can't remember, 2013, I think. So you can see that it's not just R2P, it's a package deal. And at the bottom you can see, because it's in the news, because it was yesterday or the day before yesterday, there was the Sakharov Prize for 2023 to Iranian opposition. You can see the importance, symbolic importance. Parliamentary diplomacy uses a lot of declaratory diplomacy, because that's one of the key elements it can use. And to award, in October 2011, the Sakharov Prize was awarded to, as you can see, Arab Spring activists, including, you can see the last one, the last name, Mohamed Bouazizi in Tunisia, You may remember who was the one who burned himself to death to protest and started the whole Arab Spring. So you can see, Egypt, Libya, Syria, and Tunisia. So you can see that in the case of I will just go back very quickly to this one. Overwhelming majority of MEPs. That's fundamental. It means 27 member states, and the exceptions are basically the extreme left. Okay, but this is amazing in terms of it's 94% of those who voted. We're talking about the democracy. We're not talking about the dictatorship where 95% is normal. Okay, we're talking about situations where 52, 55, 60, 65% is good. We don't want the numbers show that there is really rejection. Okay, this is not North Korea, right? Now, in the case of Syria, and again, I'm not going to go into the details, but I think it's important to note that it is clear that it's a case of R2P because of the horrific numbers that I've been using from, obviously, NGOs, United Nations organization, etc. And the words of the then Secretary General Ban Ki-moon in February 2016, the situation inside Syria is as close to hell as we are likely to find on this earth. It is really heartbreaking. So this was a clear case of R2P. Now, and this is why you can see the diplomatic part of parliamentary diplomacy. The peer reaction was, of course, we need to use R2P, but let's be realistic. There's going to be a Russian veto in the UN Security Council. So what do? There's no point in engaging, in pushing for R2P if R2P is not going to be used. Because we know Russia is going to veto, because Russia used what they call the shadow of Libya, saying, well, in actuality, what happened in Libya was not R2P, was a regime change. This is confusing cause for effect, but I'm not going to go into that. So basically, we abstained, but we didn't really want to see what's going to happen. Well, we don't know what's going to happen afterwards, but we abstained. Therefore, you also are responsible for that. Then it didn't work out for a number of other reasons, but not because of R2P, because the troops were not, you could not put troops on the ground. This is a fundamental weakness of that resolution. But it was the price to pay for Russia and China to abstain, for the Arab League and for the African Union to say, okay, because the African Union didn't have the means to intervene. So they wanted to see something happen, but at the same time, they didn't want really everything to change. So it was confusing. And in the case of the Security Council, I think the number of 17 vetoes is correct. Maybe there's been more since, I can't remember if it's from the article or because the article I mentioned was published now, but I finished it in March. So maybe there have been more vetoes. But also, for instance, Moscow is reluctant to facilitate humanitarian aid in Syria. Syria, obviously, the situation is not as bad as it was, but it's still bad. But what the European Parliament did was to push for the recognition of the Syrian opposition, to push EU states to recognize the opposition, visits by Syrian opposition to Brussels, to support those countries where there were, if I remember correctly from the previous figure, there were almost 5 million have fled the country, and over 6 million have been internally displaced. 5 and 6 is 11 million. The population is under 18 million. So you can imagine what a huge population movement that there's been. Concern for minorities, especially Christian minorities in Syria. And again, we go back to the Sakharov Prize of 2011, where a Syrian laureate was celebrated. So you can see that in one case, Libya, R2P, in the other one, let's not waste our time because it's going to be a waste of time, but let's do everything we can in other directions. And I think this is what is an important aspect of when we assess R2P being implemented successfully or not. Why? What are the other means used? It's important to get the wider picture, not to say, well, look, in Libya it was implemented, but not in Syria, therefore R2P is dead, because there were a lot of, including academic articles saying R2P is dead. Look at Syria. It's the archetypal example of R2P, and it hasn't been used. Yeah, it hasn't been used because there was those reasons, but it doesn't mean it's dead. And now I'm going to go one step further with Ukraine. And this is, I think, where the case is very clear from the, again, European Parliament perspective, because it is not an R2P case. And therefore, you have to make sure that it is not used as, well, look, first of all, the Russians are using R2P to protect the Russian ethnic minorities in Ukraine. And then it doesn't apply because there is no R2P at the UN level. No, it's not an R2P case, because R2P applies to when a state is committing atrocities, crimes against its own citizens. In other words, it would have applied if Ukraine was massacring its population, or part of the population, or part of. It's not because there is a war. Therefore, the European Parliament, understanding that Russia is going to use the R2P as an excuse for invading Ukraine, goes a step back and says, we're not going to use R2P. We're not going to mention R2P. It's irrelevant. To use R2P is to play the Russian game. Therefore, we don't. So we will do everything we can, but not use R2P. And this is where you can see the sophistication of the European Parliament. When it's relevant, we use it. When it should be, but we can't, we don't. But when it's not, we will definitely not use it. If you like, it's a kind of a pedagogic approach to, because don't forget, parliaments are the link between the executive, but also the public opinion, the voters. So it's telling the voters, don't fall into the trap of R2P in Ukraine. It doesn't apply. And therefore, it's important to bear this in mind. But, and this is, if you like, again, because the European Parliament has been growing in importance, and because, sadly, international relations means that you have to be more active in international affairs because the world is going in some crazy directions, the European Parliament, the President of the European Parliament, MEPs have been extremely active over Ukraine. It is a fundamental aspect of the European Parliament. The first leader of an EU institution to meet President Zelensky in Kiev was the President of the European Parliament. And that's very symbolic. It's like, I am the President of the European Parliament, I speak in the name of the European people. And Kiev, under bombs, okay. And then you can see that they have supported they have encouraged and they have supported all the actions taken by EU member states, by NATO, by G7, etc., etc. And sanctions by the EU include Russian parliamentarians. This is something I will not develop, but it's important to note that the Russian parliamentarians are seen as representative of Russia, not only as members of their political parties or whatever. They are sanctioned because they support what is going on in Ukraine. And then they supported, the MEPs supported as you know, this new peace facility fund, and obviously the candidate status for Ukraine, which is a big issue in the current European Council taking place right now, and as you know, very, very controversial. And part of what I said, the world is going crazy, the European Parliament set up a special committee on foreign interference in all democratic processes in the European Union, including disinformation. That was in 2020, so before the war in Ukraine. And in its report of 2022, it mentions if I remember correctly, 40 or 50 pages, 30 times Russia or Moscow as a problem for the European Union, a source of disinformation. And this committee was supposed to be a special committee, and now it's become a standing committee. And the two countries mentioned more time than others are obviously, as I said, Russia and China. And then, again, going through a list, I'm not going to go through all of them, but you can see all the actions, other actions taken by the EP. The Sakharov Prize awarded in October 2022 to the Ukrainian people. The Ukrainian people, okay? In November 22, Russia is declared a state sponsor of terrorism. That's, in diplomacy, that's clear. Okay, they're parliamentarians, but in diplomatic terms, it's very clear. And it was 494 members in favor. So you can see, again, overwhelming support. Immediately after that, there was an attack, a cyber attack on the EP site, not surprisingly. President Zelensky's first parliamentary speech address was to the European Parliament at the beginning of the war. And then later on, he visited Brussels. When he went to Washington, London, and Brussels, he visited the European Parliament. Then you can see all the if you like, the actions taken. And it's interesting, this is at the bottom, Russia took countermeasures, sanctions against MEPs, sanctions against the then European Parliament president. So when you hear that parliamentary diplomacy and all those declarations, they don't make any difference. Well, why would Russia bother if it didn't make any difference? Question mark. Okay. But I think it's important to bear in mind this. R2P is not part of the Ukrainian debate, but it is, but the EP reaction, the EU reaction, but the EP reaction in particular is evidence of assistance to people in danger. And this is a fundamental part of, if not the letter, the spirit of the concept of R2P, the protection of civilians. So, trying to bring all those threads together, and if you like a kind of a conclusion, important to support, defend and promote R2P. The European Parliament plays what is called in the academic literature on parliamentary diplomacy an international moral tribune role. That's clear in the case of Libya. Now, of course, Libya, after the intervention in 2011, is still in a mess. But that's not because R2P has failed. Its responsibility to rebuild has failed. Responsibility to prevent failed. Responsibility to react worked in the sense that at least the atrocities stopped. But then it didn't work. But it was important. In Syria, as I said, it was important to not undermine the concept because there was a veto by Russia. Sometimes the veto in the UN Security Council was Russia and China. And it is important to look, as I said, R2P, how we use it as part of all the measures taken as necessary to save lives. And the report I mentioned, I always mention this when I talk about R2P, is the Joe Cox report of 2017. And I mention this because it's a very useful report, it's online, and because also as a kind of a tribute to Joe Cox, who was an MP who was assassinated during the Brexit campaign, and she had started the report. So I think it's important to mention someone who was fighting for R2P. And if you are interested in more on parliamentary diplomacy and more on today's talk, I don't put a long list of all the others who have worked on it. And I don't want to favor my publications. I only put them there because there is a long reference in each of them. So you can find a lot of very useful publications on both parliamentary diplomacy and on R2P in those publications. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Stavridis, for this very comprehensive speech, lecture about parliamentary diplomacy. I have some questions, but the only thing I would like to say is that it's something that really I didn't understand well. One thing is what is responsible to protect and not, and what cases we have. Of course, Libya is a very clear case. You mentioned that the case of Ukraine is not a case, or it was not considered such a case. One question is, if between the period of 2014 and 2022, after Crimea and the incidents in Donbass, the Russian argument was that there is a strict violation and atrocities by the Ukrainian side in the Donbass region. In Donbass region belonged to Ukraine, and despite the fact that they had declared autonomous status and they were not part of the Russian Federation, and at that time it was not annexed by Russia, there were Ukrainian citizens. There was any reaction or any investigation. Two questions on that. Russia argument included in his presentation of what was doing in Donbass the principle of responsibility to protect or not? And secondly, there was any investigation or any, let's say, discussion in the European Parliament about what was going in Donbass? I'm not saying that adopting the Russian argument, at least investigating what was going in Donbass. This is my two questions. And a third one, that's for the case of Gaza. As far as I understood, there is not a case in Gaza as well. Of course, but if we consider that the Palestinian people in Gaza, in Western Bank, are not independent. The Palestinian Authority, although holds a chair in the United Nations Assembly, is not a state in real terms. So the Palestinians are subject to the Israeli occupation for many people. Is there in case that in the European Parliament there is some discussion about if responsibility to protect is a case for Gaza? Yeah, if you like, we could collect some two questions if there are, and then we could you could respond to that. Is there any question or a point of clarification? Yes, identify yourself and please. We have a microphone, please. Here in the second line.
Thank you for your lecture. It was very informative and quite, you can say, rare to find these kind of lectures in university here. What I would like to ask is, do you believe that the NATO intervention to Yugoslavia in 1999 for the Kosovo War, was it a case of responsibility to protect, like the, according to your lecture, do you believe it was a case?
It was not such principle at that time.
Shall I start with?
Yeah, you could respond.
Thank you for your question. Yes, as Professor Tsaradanides was hinting, 99 there was no responsibility to protect as a concept accepted in principle as such, and then the lawyers would come in and say, well, it's a concept, it's not a rule, therefore it's not. Then you get into the nuances of international relations at the UN, especially where words matter and you can play on this and you can. 99, there was no R2P as such, therefore it is only a kind of looking back with a new concept, a situation that had already taken place. It is a very good question as well, because Kosovo was extremely criticized by Russia. But I can't remember, I think it was in the Georgia war, I think it was Georgia, maybe even Ukraine, as you mentioned in 2014. Russia uses Kosovo as a, well, look what happened, we are doing the same thing. So it was a totally rejecting their own position because it's, and it was interesting because it was like, well, if you didn't buy Kosovo, why do you buy it now? So it's an interesting one. But Kosovo is an interesting case. I mentioned Srebrenica and the Rwanda genocide. There was a UK Parliament report on the intervention in Kosovo. And if I remember correctly, I think it's in the article, if I remember correctly, the phrasing, it was like it was legally not, they don't use the word acceptable, it was like it was not justified, it was not legally justified, but it was morally acceptable. In other words, the end was the same as an R2P situation, if you like, or atrocity crimes. Therefore, although legally there was no UN Security Council resolution, although at the end of the day it saved lives, okay, then it opened the Pandora box. But for those of us who are a bit older, since the death of Tito,
Who is older?
No, just generally. Since the death of Tito, we knew that Yugoslavia was going to collapse. The problem was how violent it was going to be. And the hope was it was not going to be violent, and sadly, it was extremely violent. But I think this is a kind of... but Kosovo is a good example, because Kosovo is a bit... and okay, I live in Spain and we are in Greece, 2 of the 5 EU countries that don't recognize Kosovo, although they participate in EU actions in Kosovo. Kosovo is a very good example, because it's like, yes, but can you let things go even worse than they already are? And if you have the means to intervene, and that's the question of the capacity to intervene, ideally you should be a UN force. We all know that, but it doesn't exist. So. Which brings me back, I will go backwards in your questions, Professor Tzadanithi. Gaza is under Hamas control, therefore Israel is not part of this. And the West Bank is divided in sections, and although there is a lot of violence in the West Bank, it is in zones. Although there's a lot of violence, and this is not new, it's been going on for years, it's been accelerated with the post-7th of October attack in Israel. It's not atrocities crime. It's not, they have to be proven that it is atrocities crimes, and then you have to see who is responsible. And in the case of West Bank, it will be complicated. In the case of Gaza, it's not, because Israel is not in charge of, if there is atrocity crimes in those cases, it would be under the Convention on Genocide, on atrocity crimes, on crimes against humanity, on ethnic cleansing, not under R2P. So it's not saying, I'm not saying there are no atrocity crimes. That's the issue that has to be confirmed. But then, if this is confirmed, it will not be under R2P. It will be under the other. There are plenty of conventions and conventions on atrocity crimes. R2P is the latest addition, if you like. So R2P will not apply there, but there will be other dimensions that can be applied to then have a trial.
But the International Penal Court has already started investigating both cases, Hamas.
But not under R2P. But not under R2P. It's under genocide, ethnic cleansing, or crimes against. No, it's under crimes against war crimes and crimes against humanity, which are, if you like, the easiest to identify. And therefore, this is where you go first, because genocide is complex, and ethnic cleansing, it has to be very specific. But it's not under R2P, because R2P should be Hamas killing their own people. So. And in the case of the 2014-2022 situation in Donbass and Crimea, no, because there was no much fight. There was violence, but not much. It's not being used by the European Parliament, in the sense that the aggressor is Russia. So it's not the Ukraine committing. Again, you always have to look at R2P through the lenses of the state in charge, the regime in charge. There are atrocities, there are crimes, you investigate, but not R2P. You cannot use R2P, because R2P has to be intentionally killing your own people for a specific reason. Or could be.
My question was, if Russia used the argument.
Russia used, this is
for the case of Donbass.
Protection of ethnic Russians is a classic. I mean, this is a traditional Russian argument. Yes, they were being killed, therefore we have intervened. Now the question is this the case, really? And then even if you do that, you do not finally annex the region, because by international law you cannot annex another country's regions by force. So this is, again, international law, international practice, but R2P wouldn't apply for those cases. And this is, the European Parliament was very clear on this one on Ukraine from the start. Let's not mention R2P. It doesn't make any sense in Ukraine. But because Russia is going to say protection of ethnic Russians, let's make sure that we go against their position with other means, but not R2P. Because if if you use a concept if you stretch the concept too much, it will just explode. And you will lose what we have gained, because the fact that so many countries have decided that R2P is relevant is some advance in a terrible world. Not much, but it's there. And the fact that the parliamentarians are engaged into that, and the fact that especially the European Parliament is extremely coherent and consistent on its position on R2P is also very important. So you have to, is it the half full or half empty? Well, the half full is sometimes good enough because it was totally empty before that.
Some other questions? Yes, please.
One question.
If you like, identify yourself.
My name is Tom Mazarakis. I'm from the States and I live in Greece now. I just wanted to ask a relevant question. It's not exactly relevant to R2P, but I was just thinking when you were talking about Russia and their right to veto. And just for my information purposes, why does Russia have the right to veto?
Okay. Yeah, this is the UN Charter of 1945. The victors, the winners of the Second World War, were given a veto right to set up, when the United Nations was set up. And this was the only way that powers, the winning powers, would accept to be part of this new system, because in the previous system, the League of Nations, there was no veto, and the Americans didn't join, and the Germans left before they started becoming very aggressive under the Nazi regime. So it was a way of saying, if you want a system to work, you need to have the powers involved. What is the guarantee you give them to be part of this? What is the incentive you give them? The veto. Then it was 50 states, roughly 52 states. China was not, it was Taiwan that was a member of the Security Council. So China only becomes a member of the Security Council in the 70s, early 70s. That's
with a veto.
With a veto, because it replaces the China of Taiwan, and therefore it has a veto. And you have 15 members. You need a majority of 11, I think it's the right number.
Five
have a veto. So if the veto powers do not veto, abstain or vote in favor, and you have 11 out of 15, because you have 5 permanent and then you have 10 that rotate on a regular basis representing continents. Now, the big debate is the reform of the UN Security Council, because Brazil, Mexico, Nigeria, India, Japan, the list is very long. Germany, well, it's very long. And the question is, okay, let's enlarge. There is an agreement, a consensus of enlarging the UN Security Council, but are they going to be permanent? Which is, okay, why not? But that's a big question between the Africans, the Latin Americans, the Asians, it's not our business. But are they going to have veto power? That's the catch. Because if they become permanent, but they don't have a veto power, well, they're not really. There's third category. You have the P5, the new, but not veto, and the old ones. The French have presented the French out of the P5 have pushed for lifting the veto in cases of like R2P and other situations. But we know that it's going to be a question of, okay, let's talk about this issue. Is this a case of R2P? Veto. Then you can lift the veto for R2P. But if you say veto before R2P, that's it. And the other problem is, well, not a problem, the other advance, if you like, now the UN Security Council is obliged to explain vetoing to the UN General Assembly 2 months, I think it's 2 months after a veto. There is a compulsory obligation. There was a UN General Assembly resolution passed saying, if there is a veto, you need to explain to us why you vetoed. It's not enough to say, I vetoed because I'm a P5. And that is a kind of a reaction from the other states saying, when we're talking, and in the case of R2P it's clear, atrocity crimes, the veto becomes almost insulting.
Okay, well, but my question comes from the fact that when the UN was formed in 1945, it wasn't Russia that joined, it was the Soviet Union that was the power. When the Soviet Union dissolved in the early 90s,
Yeah, Russia.
Why did Russia just assume the veto power?
Well, that's what it did.
That's what it did.
Yeah, no, because Russia accepted to be the successor state of the Soviet Union. I'm not a lawyer, but legally they said whatever the Soviet Union has committed itself to, we take it over. Of course, the Soviet Union collapsed, so then you had new countries and independent countries, But Moscow said, I was the capital of the Soviet Union, I am the capital of Russia, therefore I am in the UN. And everybody accepted it because you have to think always of instability in the world system. You can imagine if suddenly there was a vacant P5 seat and who's going to get it, So yeah, it was just because obviously Russia wanted it and because everybody said it's in our interest that nothing changes there because we already have the Soviet Union collapsing. That's big enough,
So there was no rule, there was no regulation. It was just assumed that.
If I add something on that, because the United Nations Security Council is based due to the unsuccessful example of the League of Nations in the interwar period. It is based on the principle, which is realpolitik, that if you have 5 permanent members which are great powers, the great powers are much more responsible. And because of that, they had in their mind what happened in the Congress of Vienna in 1815, when it's supposed that a permanent peace for about 80 years was in Europe, which is not true actually, because there was this Congress of Vienna of the then great powers, including France. The second question about why Russia is that Russia, exactly for this concept which is continuing, is a great power because it is a nuclear power. Okay, many analysts say that Russia today is not a superpower, but it is a big, let's say, middle powers with nuclear weapons, which is very important. Okay, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Is there any other question? So, if there is not any other question, I would like to thank Dr. Stavridis for accepting our invitation and giving us this very interesting lecture. And I would like also to thank all of you for coming on the eve of Christmas. Oh no, we have 15 days to attend this lecture. Thank you very much.